Okay, that's great. So, as I said beforehand, thank you ever so much for everybody coming along to our session today. It's today's public policy design event, Policy Blueprinting, a tool for 21st century policy design from Nesta. I'm delighted to introduce two of our speakers today. So we have Suraj and Andy, and I will hand over to them to introduce themselves properly and talk us through the event.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'll start. So, yes, Suraj, I work at an organization called Nesta, and I look after our design and technology team. And we work on, well, I'll explain that in a minute, but 3 missions to improve the UK. Andy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy. So I sit within the design and tech practice at Nesta, but also sit within the Sustainable Future mission, where I'm design lead.
Oh, you both currently
hello.
Yeah.
Hello, yes, sorry. No, we were joking at the beginning of this talk that the title, or sorry, the tagline's a bit clickbait. So yeah, we do apologize for that. We don't unfortunately have any silver bullets to kind of reinvent necessarily public policy in this talk, but we hopefully have some valuable lessons and mistakes that we can share with folks that furthers the practice. And I'm going to take us through, I guess, the first half of a few slides that we have. Then Andy will take on the rest. We hope that will leave us with a decent chunk of time as well for a nice kind of informal conversation at the end, because we really want to, I guess, learn from other people, share kind of good practice as well in this. So just a bit of context to what, in terms of what to expect. I'll talk about what Nesta is and the policy blueprinting technique that we've been exploring. Andy will talk about lessons from that practice and some of the next steps that we're really excited about, and then we'll have a conversation. So Nesta is a charity, and we work to design and test, scale solutions to some of the UK's most pressing challenges. We call these challenges missions, and we work on 3 specifically. So the first one is about ensuring every young person, so under 5s in particular, has a fair start in life. The second is all about the food environment and ensuring that is enabling people to lead a healthier life. And then the third, where the example today sits, is all about a sustainable future and specifically decarbonizing home energy. So what are missions? I mean, it's kind of on trend, and you might have heard missions at the moment. So we thought we would just kind of touch on that. We've been practicing this for, I don't know, 3.5, 4 years in terms of mission-oriented working. And this is kind of some of the things that are emerging. I think the first step is really kind of a slightly longer term and more outcome focused view on a challenge, and particularly those challenges are systemic and complex, or could be seen as wicked problems. And that's obviously really informed some of the work we'll be sharing today. The other element is that it requires multiple skills and ways of knowing and making progress these challenges. We call them kind of multi-skilled teams. And often those skills are not, they're beyond more than one organization. And I think this case today is a very good example of actually how we're trying to expand that view of how you can make progress on these things. You need multiple points of intervention to work on these complex challenges. So that's where portfolios come in. And equally, because there's lots of uncertainty, it's very hard to draw a clear path or to know how to navigate that. So testing and learning sense and responding is a prudent way to kind of make progress. So that's kind of what missions are, the kind of context, the scene setting. And I think at the beginning of this year, Andy will correct me if I'm wrong later on, but we kind of had this situation or challenge. You know, how might we build confidence in and begin to de-risk a large scale and systemic policy? Like why is that important in terms of building confidence and de-risking? Well, we want to make sure things work, right? They have a chance of succeeding. So that's really kind of one of the big driving factors around this. There's also a big element of unintended consequences or potential harmful effects with big complex policies and initiatives. So really important that we start to de-risk some of that stuff as early as possible. And also some of the background to this was, how can we increase the planning and delivery rigor? So often with public policy work, the disconnect between policy and delivery can be quite stark. So how can you start front loading some of those things? So that was all bubbling around for us at the beginning of this year. And where we landed, this is the other kind of bit of context, was We also knew there was a policy proposal kind of emerging, or a policy concept, if you want to put it in those terms, about a coordinated approach to low carbon heat. Essentially, what this looks like are neighborhoods or areas all working together to transition to more sustainable forms of heating. And you can kind of see there, like in brackets, what can go wrong, right? Like it sounds like a pretty straightforward, logical idea. Great stuff. On the right-hand side, you can see one of the pieces of work we developed through this process. We described it a bit as a policy architecture. So this was one way to, I guess, conceptualize and more easily convey some of the thinking behind that proposal. But I think what I'd highlight is that it was still very much a proposal at that stage. There was still lots of uncertainty, complexity, and kind of ambiguity. And that's what led to us thinking about this approach that we're going to take you through in a short case study. The gist of it is essentially it's both a tool and a collaborative process. And as you can see in the bottom left there, the process involved like roughly 3 big components. The first thing was like mapping the system, understanding the situation, and that's largely using something like the blueprint tool that you can see on the right-hand side, but all other mapping methods as well. It wasn't limited to that. The second step of that process was convening and critiquing. So again, if this is a challenge that's shared by multiple actors across a big sector or a big situation, it follows that we want to bring those people together to kind of make progress on it. And then the third point is about synthesis and recommendations. So the timing of this project was we wanted to align this with a policy note that we were working on. So that's where things kind of culminated. And I think in the next few slides, I'm going to try and bring this to life by just focusing on, again, particularly public policy design and how we were trying to address some of the challenges we'd identified in that work through this piece of work here. So I think one of the key challenges is obviously that policy to delivery gap or kind of connection. What it looked like for us and how we kind of bridged that was ranging from obviously good old stakeholder interviews through to nice participatory workshops. Importantly, the thing here, though, was it was cross-sector. So I think we had something like over 100 contributors, like ranging from local government, national government, energy providers, infrastructure organizations, regulators, research organizations, NGOs, civil society, and even trailblazers. So the people that are already doing kind of coordinated approaches to kind of green transitions were all involved throughout the course of this work in those different kind of interactions. Like, why did we think that would be helpful, and how did it help? So in particular, that diversity helped to surface some of the key tensions and risks and assumptions really early on. When you have, for example, it's common to find senior political representatives sitting alongside kind of technology manufacturers. You can just really quickly surface where things aren't going to work or where there might be challenges, and then you can take them offline and do further kind of great test and learn work to kind of make progress. The other thing that this was supported by, you can't really identify who you need to bring together without mapping the system. And so hence you can kind of start to see the logic of why mapping the system was quite important. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see a lovely visual where we started, near the end of the work, we started to kind of really synthesize down who those kind of key actors were. Being a bit more reflective, however, we would have loved to involve residents more. I think that was a slight limitation of this work, just given time constraints and other kind of factors. But we're overall really quite pleased with the kind of pace and breadth. The second area I wanted to kind of zoom in on in this case study was this idea of really expanding the scope. So, like, again, as I mentioned, it's a bit clickbait, policy blueprinting, but it's also a bit deliberate in the sense that there's lots of value in service blueprinting, and there's lots of ways to do that. And there's nothing that prevents actually the boundary of it being extended. And that was the kind of one of the driving forces, I suppose, behind this notion of policy blueprinting as a technique, where actually what does it really look like to expand the end-to-end and the front-to-back to be obviously multi-year, or to be thinking about regulation and policy and other kind of factors. And we really considered also time and the idea of pace layers in terms of this, in terms of things move at different paces in this. And you can see on the right-hand side, this notion of zooming in and zooming out, again, is a critical design capability, and we really lean into that where, for example, the architecture diagram at the top was useful in terms of quickly bringing people up to speed, but then you zoom in to the blueprint itself near the kind of bottom right to really kind of get into the details, because there's a lot of kind of nuance within this. And we use many other mapping techniques actually beyond just those two things. So it's not necessarily that the blueprinting is just one format. And we have a template, obviously, you can use that we've kind of put out in a bit of a blog. But this is where I guess the craft and the expertise really comes in terms of like figuring out the right way to kind of visualize and make sense of that challenge so that others can collaborate. I guess we could have gone even more. So different resolutions is kind of the key point here. We could have zoomed in even further. And I think, again, that's a pragmatic choice. Like you look at that bottom right, there is tons of detail hidden in each of those little boxes that you can see or hopefully see. And again, we had to make that kind of trade-off of like, what's the right level to work at with this? And I think 3 or 4 in terms of just this little case study. The other kind of aspect, I suppose, on public policy design challenges is complex things are just really hard to see and understand and work with. And this is where I think the kind of, let's say, harder skills of design can be particularly helpful. And where, again, the tool, like the blueprint itself, was a deliberate mechanism for enabling all these diverse actors to collaborate. And as you can see in the top right, an example from one of our in-person workshops where we have, stakeholders co-developing, co-designing, critiquing, improving this kind of policy concept together. The other way we tried to make things tangible, or I should say before that, the risk though, is that people feel that that tangible thing is reality, but it isn't, right? The map is not reality. It can feel quite solid and tangible, right? A goes to B and then B goes to C. But actually, this is a hypothesis here that we're trying to test and kind of co-develop. And there's always a tension in like how we hold that lightly. Andy has consistently used that term. I think it's a great way of describing how you hold the work lightly so you can adapt and learn. And one of the ways we tried to incorporate that was with kind of serious gaming techniques, again, in the workshops, where you start to make realistic. So like, okay, great. In this proposal, we're talking about zoning and planning regulations for different physical areas. That sounds nice and simple, doesn't it? Well, let's see how it is by prototyping it through a serious games exercise. And again, just even through something simple and efficient like that, you surface so many insights. It's certainly not new. I forgot to mention it at the beginning of this, like the kind of case study. We really took inspiration from all the great work that's kind of been happening across government and beyond, things like Policy Lab as well in this, and kind of trying to extend the field as well. And last but not least, in terms of the case study, and I'll hand over to Andy, was just this notion of, I guess, testing and learning in the open. So again, because large-scale systemic issues have lots of complexity and uncertainty and dependencies, like most public policy challenges, we felt that taking a test and learn approach was really important. And it's also core to many like design approaches. But importantly, because this is a systemic challenge, we felt that it should be done in collaboration with other system actors. Nobody owns the whole problem. Nobody owns the whole situation. It's often diffuse and distributed. And thus the kind of working in the open and taking people with you logic. What you can see on this slide is, again, just see some of those, I guess, project touch points, if you will, of how we were interfacing with the wider network. And why, why would we think this was important? We felt taking people with us leads to better results. As I previously discussed about the assumptions and uncertainties, there are people in the system who are just far better placed at understanding it. They're far better placed to design what we're doing. They're far better placed to deliver what we're doing. And indeed, the role here then is to be more of a facilitator or a steward. It's hard though, right, to make that shift. Like being a collaborator in a shared system rather than being a competitor in a market. We're just not sometimes set up or incentivized to do that. But I think that's possibly where, being a public-oriented organization like Nesta, so we're in a very lucky position to have kind of a charitable purpose to enable this and kind of resources to do that. Similarly, government in the kind of unique, somewhat impartial position I think that's a real role, right, for kind of public design and other ways of thinking about this work, where you can convene and enable the glue work that needs to happen to make systems and services function better. So just to close my kind of case study overview, you've probably got the sense that the map is not reality. But, what you're seeing here are somewhat polished outputs, but the reality of the work is just far messier. And I think it was like in 1959, Charles Lindblom coined this expression, the science of muddling through, to capture the spirit and practical approach to large-scale policy problems. And I think it just really nicely resonates with design skills and approaches as well. Because often that's very much part of the craft. And again, it's my kind of personal and humble view here that design skills and approaches have a lot to offer on how you can safely and effectively and skillfully muddle through to deliver public value. And again, this has just been one kind of example of how we've done it. And Andy's now going to take you through some of the lessons on that journey. And seamlessly, I'll stop sharing and hand over.
So if there's any echo, we'll just switch over screens. Thanks, Suraj. Great. Hoping everyone can see that now. So I'm going to talk more about some of the lessons that we've taken away from that initial phase of work with what we formerly called coordinated switching, now clean heat neighborhoods, and also touch on some of the ways that it's helped us to define kind of our role in the system and kind of shape the work going forward. So first up, and some of these I think Suraj touched on in the case study as well. One of the big lessons was about who we had in the room. I think we engaged a lot of people across the system, but how do we get those more challenging voices? How do we get those people who really offer that constructive critique to engage with this work when it may not be their day-to-day, their priority? And one of the interesting things through running workshops, both in person and online, was just the value in convening people at different levels of the system in person to have a conversation. The example about the manufacturer and the senior kind of government official was really eye-opening. You could see in real time the misalignment between the regulation and policy and the understanding from supply chain, and it was that kind of those insights that weren't captured on the blueprint that started to shape kind of our role in the system. I think to build on that, one thing that we didn't make explicit necessarily in the workshops was the key levers that we may need to be pulled to shift the system and create that change. I think one thing we'd look to do in future, and we've done this on the Miro template, is make that more of an explicit step in what are those key things that we need to address. Or what are the parameters, the interactions, the structures, or the beliefs that we really need to address, and they're an opportunity to kind of shift the system. We shared the Miro template as part of a blog on the process. Really interested if anyone's used it or engaged with it, and we see it as a work in progress as well. It's something that we're looking to roll out or try within Nesta and other contexts. I think this lesson also follows on from Suraj's point about muddling through and kind of the role of mapping. The blueprint is a really useful tool to gather insight and to start to discover areas of consensus and to consider the system at different levels. I think it's less useful when communicating a vision and to bring people on board who may be slightly less engaged. So I think stepping back and communicating the key outcomes throughout the process and at different stages has proved really valuable. I think that I might just flick back actually. There's a photo, and I've never really realized this, but on this photo in the top right, you can see where the post-its are collected around the blueprint. And I think it's it's a really interesting method to really start to pick apart those kind of subtle signals about where stakeholders and those who have engaged with it see the problems. As much as we tried to prompt in certain workshops to focus on the right-hand side of the blueprint, it was often kind of the similar kind of areas that would come out for critique and discussion. And then this final lesson is maybe one more about kind of mission-driven working. We had a really great team who worked on this, who we ran the workshops around GB, and built a level of kind of tacit knowledge through the conversations we were having, through the workshops that we were running. As we've moved into kind of a new phase and considered our role in the system, I think carrying that momentum and ensuring that the tacit knowledge is carried through and protected is something we should really focus in on. It means that kind of progress can be made and you're not losing momentum moving forward. So what are our plans to follow on from this? Well, we've used and borrowed language from Vinova and the mission playbook that was put together by Dan Hill here. But we think that the blueprinting and the convening really helped us to define that system. So the role of the team initially was around system definition with an element of that normalizing and influencing. So we published a report, we published recommendations, but we also fed into a wider policy plan that colleagues across the Sustainable Future team put together and published just after the election in July. So moving from that initial phase of predominantly system definition and normalizing and influencing, this next phase we see is shifting about testing some of those underlying assumptions, some of the riskier sections of the kind of framework and model that we've built in the blueprint, but also an element of capacity building, working with the stakeholders who've engaged and continuing to engage with more actors at different levels of the system to really start to build capacity around the concept of coordinated delivery and switching of low carbon heat, and to almost become a kind of node in the system ourselves. And through that prototyping, through that capacity building, we see a kind of the third key role for the team around normalizing and influencing, being a real advocate for the elements of the proposal and the work that are really working for people. So those are our three roles. It's quite a task to kind of consider that across a policy system. So there was a need to really focus in on areas where we thought the opportunity may lie for us as Nesta and for the wider system to really kind of shift from the current model to this kind of envisaged blueprint. So to do that, we kind of reflected on the workshops, we've engaged with stakeholders, and we kind of focused in on these three areas that we call areas for collaboration, and they sit at different points across the blueprint, and it allows us to again hold this blueprint lightly, but really kind of give confidence about the areas where we see some of the difficulties and some of the tensions lying. So we've created those three areas that we're looking to collaborate, and we pushed those back out to everyone who'd worked on this project with us. We've published them online, and we've presented these as opportunities where we want to embrace prototyping and demonstrators to de-risk. So really focusing in on that first role that we're playing of prototyping, demonstrating, and bringing different parties together to do that. So that and it also details the types of organizations we're looking to work with. It's acted as a bit of a shortcut so that we can have more informed conversations with partners about the difficulties they're facing, how we may help overcome some of those, and vice versa, the things that we're really focused on that we just don't have the expertise, the knowledge, or the kind of in this instance, kind of the local context and contacts. So the second role that we're playing, this capacity building role, we see in its current form being a knowledge sharing, normalizing, and advocating role. So we're starting to collect case studies for areas where these kind of schemes are already happening. They may not be called coordinated switching or clean heat neighborhoods, but just highlighting and normalizing different approaches so that the barrier to other areas taking learnings and developing the capacity is reduced. And we also want to collect or commission research that generates evidence that's useful to the system. So we're running an RCT with our sister organisation, the Behavioural Insights team, and it'll be an online RCT to look at households' response to area-based schemes. To shape this research, we asked those that had been involved with the work to share their understanding of the available evidence on different formats of area-based schemes, but also to highlight any areas where there was an evidence gap, so that we can really tailor that research to be as useful as possible for the system. And then a final role is this normalizing and influencing, this advocating, presenting partners with the latest thinking and making sure that is communicated to decision makers. So we're developing content to communicate the ideas from the blueprint to a much wider audience, whether that's homeowners or whether that's decision makers. And we're looking to play the role of bringing interested parties together to further the work that individually they may not be able to undertake. So those are the three roles that we see ourselves playing. And I just wanted to touch on some emergent kind of themes about how this kind of mode of operating differs from some of the ways we've been working on projects internally at Nesta. So I think we have a core team on the project with those three roles defined and embraced by that core team. And within that, it allows us to flex and into the interdisciplinary teams work with a broad problem, but with an understanding of the role that they're playing and the needs of the system. And it allows us to touch on that the pace layers point that Suraj mentioned earlier. It means that we can tie kind of the slower, longer to move work with the faster, more reactive pieces, and that it gives teams the confidence to be able to lean into that and to embrace it. Another key point is this holding things slightly and empowering those closest to the challenge. So through having that core team, we're able to contribute a collective knowledge to kind of our understanding in the blueprint and feed that up and help to communicate that within Nesta, so that those directly involved with the work are shaping the way forward. It's always a challenge and it can be really uncomfortable when there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think having that, again, that interdisciplinary team balances some of those factors out. And then one of the final points to touch on was, I think it's developed our thinking in terms of the role we play as Nesta in moving this forward. And I think it also touches on the humility we hope to bring to trying to facilitate some change within the system. And it also kind of reflects on the change we're seeing in our relationship with external partners and stakeholders. We're having those high quality conversations about how we partner and where ours and others' goals may align. And I think we now see a role more as a system steward over that of an architect, kind of working with different actors and different roles towards outcomes and shared outcomes over potentially defining a very rigid route to impact or capacity building or scale. And I think that, again, having the blueprint and holding it lightly enables that. It gives us that flex to be like, this is the outcome. These are the things we've heard. Let's work with the partners and I suppose be opportunistic to test, to learn, and to try and build certainty in certain elements without overly defining and designing exactly the path to kind of scale and impact. So I think that's all from kind of my section. I know we've got a few prompts for chats, but I don't know, Suraj, if you had anything to build.
We can leave you on audio still, I think. Yeah, that's us, Sarah. Then we can move into a conversation.
That was fantastic. Thank you ever so much, both. That was really, really interesting. We've already started having some questions that people were popping in as you were going through the presentation. So Sam, I know you put the first one up. Do you want to come off camera to kind of discuss that, or would you like me to read it out?
I think it's a fairly straightforward question. Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, so when you were creating that map, or that sort of final one that we saw, because I'm a service designer, so I have quite a lot of experience with service mapping. How did you change the map? Did you start with the service map and change it, or did you start with a completely different type of map with different facets on it?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, right? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'll kick off on this, and then Andy can loop in. I actually saw this question and I thought sharing a thing in a classic designer style, right? So this was us probably formalizing what we did. And again, it's just that point about modeling through, right? The reality of this is we probably made it up a fair bit, as much as we did build on kind of previous experience. But the things I would highlight as the key differences from service blueprinting as a discrete thing would be the resolution you're operating at is first of all. So actually the item 3 here, where you say the different actors, yeah, like in a service blueprint, you've got kind of like service user and then service deliverer. That is generally within the scope of one organization, or like an ecosystem of like systems and services that you control. The resolution we're operating at here with a policy blueprint or a system blueprint is further zoomed out. Actually, there are multiple organizations, potentially even multiple industries interacting, far less control over these things. So I think that's it's hard to convey in the visual, but that's what the actors tries to get at. Actually, more explicit about you have different actors interacting in this. The other thing is, we do, and this again references, I guess, leverage points and system thinking a little bit as well, but we're trying to go deeper. So point 5 here is like, let's really be explicit about the ecosystem and policy level here. That does come through in traditional backstage mapping. But again, you want to make that really explicit. And again, with this formalization, you can see how we're trying to think about the system leverage points. So they're all important. You need to work in portfolio on these types of things, but how can you just make sure there's spread or identify with this gaps? The final thing I'd probably highlight would be some of this stuff about the interactions or relationships between elements. We know this is fundamental, this even in traditional service design, but when you have multiple actors and systems interacting, there's often different incentives at play. And that's what some of that overlay stuff can really help you think about. Like, again, so for example, we do stuff in the food environment as well. The interests of food companies might possibly be different to the interests of food regulators, right? So that's quite curious. How do you surface that and how do you deal with that challenge? Andy?
Yeah, I don't know whether necessarily have much to add, really. I think that maybe one reflection on one of the key changes was, I suppose, the stages that you get in service mapping. I think we were less attached to those stages, and we had an initial kind of straw person concept that we visualized, but those stages kind of naturally evolved and shifted throughout kind of the project, whereas I think they tend to be more fixed. So that was one thing that kind of really stood out, was that how much it fluxed compared to like traditional mapping. And one other thing we constantly discussed is whether we were mapping kind of a speculative vision or the kind of transition, and we went more towards that kind of speculative policy vision over a transition from the status quo to now. But there are still elements of that we thought we'd include. So at the beginning and end of the blueprint for clean heat neighborhoods, there's a piece about awareness and direction setting, which is more of a transitionary thing. And then there's a section at the end around reporting and iteration, which should be like ultimately there, but we've made explicit as a transitionary part of the system as well. Yeah, so a few nuances, I think. Though.
Does that make sense? I don't know what you think.
Yes, like it does make a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense that you would be that zoomed out. It's kind of understanding what level of fidelity you need for the challenge. And then I guess like when you said you were sort of looking at the speculative policy position rather than and it being more of a transitionary thing, did you consider like whether the map was the right thing for that? Because like traditionally we wouldn't necessarily like use a map as a tool to show that, I suppose, but it makes perfect sense. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I might just pick that out because there's a question from Laura around like the initial hypotheses that I think also ties into why we chose mapping. Yeah, to tie those two together, I think we had this initial hypothesis because of the work of the mission, and it was like, what is there another way? Is there a kind of coordinated kind of approach? And here's some of our assumptions about how you may get over those barriers. But that was an internal policy piece. And I suppose one of the key challenges we were trying to address is how do you bring that variety of stakeholders to critique that in a way that is manageable and also allows people to engage meaningfully with quite a kind of complex system and outside of their kind of swim lane, basically, so that they reflect kind of up and down on how their role kind of impacts other sections. So I think that's what led us towards mapping, and also hopefully kind of touches on why we put that kind of straw person concept out there initially.
I know, Laura, that kind of tied into your question. Just check if there kind of any other follow-on questions from that answer.
Hi, yes.
Yeah.
I guess I was curious in part to understand the rationale that led to the hypothesis that you then took a design approach on. But the other reason I was asking is that we know that taking a design approach ultimately de-risks the end product, whatever it is, a service, a policy, and make sure that the policy is able to achieve its intent. But it implies a degree of upfront investment. And maybe this is slightly different, as you said, within Nesta because of your purpose and your mission. But just curious, in this case, if you've had that hypothesis, that was enough internally, you said, to make the case, to make the investment. But if you're not in the lucky position to have a charity mission, yeah, just wondering about thoughts for how you make the case for that level of upfront investment, which I believe is necessary, but can sometimes be hard to get the backing for.
I can start on that. I mean, because again, this is it's a challenge for the whole field, right? Of designing ways of working in many ways, and I think this also touches on one of the other questions I spotted about being participatory, right? Like the stakeholder mapping and taking people with you. Like it's so hard sometimes to convince stakeholders and colleagues to make space and time for that work. And when I was reading that, and then I heard your kind of follow-on question there, that the initial thing that came to my mind was actually empathy. So that really leaning into the great design skills and practices that many of us bring or have affinity towards. But that empathy is directed towards like, well, what are people scared about? Or what's the risk that's going on here? And how can I actually connect and meet with people where they're at on that? And often just speak the language That's something we're not particularly great at. Visual communication, yes, often very good. Verbal communication, variable. And that's the thing. I was like, well, how's the mental model working, and what kind of makes sense? And you've correctly identified we're in a unique and often lucky position to be like we have that freedom or the scope and the backing to try some of this stuff out. In other organizations, those constraints aren't there. So in general, my kind of view is you start from where people are at and find those things that are kind of concerning them, and then offer alternatives to say, oh, it's great we're doing some forecasting and analysis and some desk research, but like for a little bit more effort or the same amount of effort, we can halve your uncertainty, because uncertainties I think you're kind of curious about, you're scared about. Let me do that with you. But actually, I've got an afternoon. Let me kind of get started on that, and I'll play it back to you, and then we can kind of work on that together. I know it can be hard and like really frustrating to kind of go the kind of long way around sometimes with these things, but I don't know. That was one of the biggest things I guess that came to my mind on that prompt question. How about you, Andy?
Yeah, I think we could have had a different starting point on this project where we spent and it doesn't have to be a considerable amount of time creating a policy architecture with desired outcomes with stakeholders. And I think there's a real strong pitch to others that is often the most efficient way of getting a lot of people to convene around a desired outcome. And we've done some of that work in other projects. We did similar work on future subsidies for low carbon heat, which was a 2-month project, but we convened people about what would future subsidies look like, and let's map out some of those different takes that we could have then taken into a much more detailed process like the one that we've gone through. So I think that even within Nesta, there's often a fear of kind of time and resource that it takes to work through some of these processes. I think really distilling it down to that kind of MVP of we can kind of be more efficient, save time, and kind of talk that similar language can help.
Thank you.
Okay, Stuart, did you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
See me?
yes, we can.
Yeah. So Stuart Bolton from DFE. I don't know. Have I got a question? I think it was. I'm just liking this. This is just sort of, resonating is a word, isn't it? And with me in terms of just being able to sort of draw out all that and make the complex sort of more observable, I suppose. I was going to say simple, but I don't think that's possible. But I think it just in terms of as of a question, thinking sort of how does this work with? Well, one of the things my experience of working in this space is, and I sort of come to the after a couple of decades really, I suppose, of one of the key things is within this is trying to find out where the sort of energy capability capacity is, working with the willing to sort of draw that out. How does that sort of help with that?
Is that about going with the flow?
It going with the flow, yeah. And I guess it's one of those things around sort of, in a way, I suppose, de-risking this for thinking from there's a question that popped up, about central government, I think more than local government, having worked across both. Central government, not wanting to go sort of with iterative approaches. So I suppose it's finding those things in terms of that working with the willing or going with the flow or whatever about, okay, look, we've got stuff here that we can deliver, in this portfolio approach of like, these are nailed on, you'll get a result with this. I can imagine someone who's a local councillor, a minister, we're like, right, yeah, you're giving them some reassurance. And then here's some stuff we can try out, we can experiment that. We might not pull this one off, but it's sort of, we will get this and this. We possibly will get that. and here's some things. Look, let's be. Hey, you want to be innovative? Everybody wants to be innovative. You can with these things, but they might not. They might not come. We might not pull them off.
Yeah, I think it's a few reactions on that initially from me is I think it's just being really attuned to the type of challenge or situation or opportunity that's available and the best approach to kind of proceed on that. So just like to make it clear, for example, like there are some situations where like the tolerance for failure is just really minimal, and also like the maturity and of the team and the enabling environment is another big factor of this stuff, right? And that might not be there equally. So a lot of things stars have to align to maybe do some of this more contemporary work. So I think it's just being attuned to that. And I really like the kind of Kynethian way of thinking about things on this as well, because like particularly when you've got high complexity, high uncertainty, basically like nobody knows the way forward. There's loads of risk. That is where some of these kind of iterative and participatory ways of working can be quite valuable. The other thing I think some of these questions in the chat made me think about were sometimes you're just trying to answer profoundly different questions, and making that clear across the wider stakeholder network can be really helpful. So like some of these questions, they're trying to say like, did it work, right? And that's the subtext behind them. And that's what's driving all the action. We don't want to mistake, we want to make sure it works. Did it work? Whereas I think with the whole designly or iterative way of working, test and learn way of working, you're asking a different question, which is like, should we change direction? And that feels like slightly, subtle and different, but I think it's quite profound in many ways, right? Because the risk is massively different. You can't make mistakes in did it work world. Like there's one shot in did it work world. Should we change direction? Well, we can try stuff out. You need both. That's the other thing as well. And I think just almost diagnosing and find the language, find the way to make sense of these things. Because if you're trying to do should we change direction style work in a did it work type challenge, you're going to be in a painful place, and vice versa. Andy.
Yeah, I don't know how to really follow that. Yeah, I think kind of agree. I think one of the appetite and the portfolio approach, I think something that we're looking to build in this next phase is that understanding that there are some of the riskier assumptions, those with the most uncertainty and the least appetite to fail, that we can test in a really safe way quickly and ensure that that it's understood and that some of the longer term, slower to move projects that probably have a lower risk attached to them, that they're going to need a different skill set almost internally, and they will happen, but in a different time frame to some of the scrappier work that we do to reduce that risk. So I think it's also presenting the approaches to the problems or to the areas that we've identified and communicating that that's done so to try and mitigate that risk and mitigate the investment and to improve the chances of kind of positive outcomes down the line, which I think people can often misconstrued if it's not kind of explicit, if they're not necessarily used to like test and learn or designerly way of kind of working.
Thanks.
Great. So just very conscious of time. So the next question that we've got from the chat was, what are your reflections on the best way of bringing people with lived experience into a system approach into policy development, bearing in mind the sensitivity of experiences for citizens in some policy areas and difficulties of putting citizens into dialogue with subject matter experts, local authorities, etc., who will likely approach the problem from very different perspectives?
Yeah, so to be open, I think it was a challenge to engage householders and to put them in the situation of the workshops in particular. One way we engaged kind of citizens and households was to engage with citizen groups who acted as a spokesperson for like their local communities. I think it's something we're really keen to explore more of, how you kind of get citizens in dialogue with subject matter experts or local or national governments, and I think we will lean into that in this next phase, and probably, having done system definition initially, lean more towards kind of the household as citizen approach later on, so that we can act as the kind of facilitator between those scales. So definitely I don't necessarily have an answer to that. It's a really knotty one, and again, it really depends on the risk as well. I think it's different subject areas will have different levels of risk and vulnerabilities with kind of the people that they're engaging.
Okay, that's yeah. So the next question is, being a service designer, measuring success has always been one of the challenges. How would you say that's done, especially with a policy perspective?
I think it was certainly outside of the scope of the initial phase of work as well. So I think what I kind of bring here is more of a holistic view, I suppose, from the other kind of service and policy design work we do. One of the key things I think is obviously that outcomes focus, and I think we are considering that with the next phase of clean heat neighborhoods, is getting the map. You might say you consult with people living in a certain neighborhood to see how this works for them. That's great. That's a tangible kind of step, but it's quite mechanical. Success, though, is probably something a little bit more abstract. It's an outcome in terms of, okay, well, how satisfied are those residents? What's the speed of response? All these types of things. And I think that then points to, actually, you've got outcomes at one level and then leading indicators. I think that's the most powerful tool we probably have in kind of like delivery orientated styles of working, as opposed to like research styles of working, which is more about lagging indicators and trials. We want to like identify those sensible, useful leading indicators, those signals, those indicators of change that give us confidence we're heading in the right direction, and then monitor those, sense and respond and adapt accordingly. Alongside lagging indicators, I think you need those. It's just the timescales are different, and early on, I think work is just a lot more adaptive.
I don't have much to add on that. I think so I've just noticed there's a follow-up question to the previous point on what's a citizens group. So just to address that quickly, we had there's a tenement block in Edinburgh that have a community group, and someone from that community group attended the workshop. So it's that kind of level, people representing a group of households, not necessarily with the context being decarbonisation. There was often a leaning towards kind of areas which had groups that were active in sustainability, but not necessarily heat. So we tried to find those kind of communities that would engage and participate in the workshops.
Cool. We've got probably time for one more question. I know, Molly, you've put something down. Do you want to kind of go into that a little bit? So the question that was in the chat was kind of more of a comment on the challenge of tangibility that you called out earlier, in the proposal of, or prototype isn't the actual thing. The fuzziness is the biggest risk I hear about from those in government, not wanting to approach policy development through iterative participatory design methods in fear of making promises for change that governments can't keep. Any kind of final thoughts on that as the last one to go through?
Yeah, it's a great, I mean, it also just to say thank you so much for a wonderful kind of conversation. Hopefully what we've shared has been a valuable kind of contribution to the great work I know many of us are doing on this call and beyond. Hold it lightly, I suppose, is the way to kind of think about these things. And just like being really clear, like in the language is very important. Like, so is it a proposal or is it a concept? Is it a hypothesis or is it a fact? Those types of things. And I think like taking people with you and like and being open and honest about that, actually, like if you situate yourself along the side of things like I'm designing with you rather than I'm designing at you, it's profoundly different, right? It's to kind of say, well, this is what I think, but you're best placed to do this, right? Citizen group, person who's running local government, all this kind of good stuff. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me how this can be better. Let's make it work together. I think is one way into it.
It's quite scary to do that as well, to stand up in front of a room and say, tell me where you're wrong. But I think it's, yeah, it brings everyone along in a moment. So
thank you so much, everyone.
thanks.
Yes. Yeah, just wanted to say thank you. I hope everyone does join me, but thank you very much both for coming along and presenting. I thought that was absolutely fantastic session. And I know there are a number of queries and questions and people have kind of requested for the recording to be sent to them. So that will be my first job this afternoon. And also a massive thank you to everyone for coming along. And I hope to see everyone at our future events next year. So thank you very much both again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.